we've already talked about the conflict that had occurred in India, particularly the revolt of 1857. And I got this map up here because this gives you an idea of how complicated this picture is. Between 1857 and 1947, when the India was divided into the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan. Basically, they were given Dominion status, like at that point Canada and Australia had under the British Empire, and then later they were made republics, the Republic of India and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. But this gives you an idea how convoluted it all was. The darkest colors are the ones that were in absolute rebellion, and there's smaller pockets. And then the lighter it gets, the more they were in favor of maintaining relations with Britain and not being rebellious. The areas that are in white, Hyderabad, for instance, and others, actually they were wanting to stay. And in fact, had they not fought on the side of the British during the 1857 rebellion, some of the larger states or provinces within India, then it would have been very unlikely that the British could regain control, but they did. So this event, the 1857 rebellion, really was the start of an organized independence movement. Obviously, there had been a lot of frustrations before, or we would not have had things like the 1820 rebellion in Bengal and the 1857 rebellion throughout much of northern India. But this was the start of the independence movement, or the Free India movement. And from 1857, as we talked yesterday, in 1876, Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England, passed legislation to make Queen Victoria the Empress of India. She was given another crown, and that led to a number of changes. The British did change their attitude and their actions in some ways, not nearly enough to satisfy many of the people in India, but they did change some of their attitudes. So this 90-year movement, after the 57 rebellion, there were a number of places in India that continued to have uprisings. Bengal, particularly, and to some extent Punjab. And interestingly enough, the provinces of Bengal and Punjab had previously been the most committed to the British. In fact, particularly the Punjab, the Sikh soldiers that came out of the Punjab, as well as the Gurkha soldiers that came out of the border with Nepal or in Nepal, they were considered the most loyal and the most trustworthy of all of the soldiers. Well, even the Punjab saw some minor uprisings after the 57 rebellion. And as a result of that, there were a number of different movements that began. There was an East India Association, an Indian National Association. Various sort of groups started trying to get organized. None of them got very far until in 1885 there was creation of an organization called the Indian National Congress. Now, when they first began, they had 72 delegates met in 1885 in Bombay, and they formed the Indian National Congress. At first, they had almost no effect. In fact, it was entirely made up of, or almost entirely made up of, elite English, British-trained professionals. They were lawyers and journalists and engineers and doctors. They were all the elite of Indian society. And they got together almost initially as a debating society. They would debate issues of various kinds, and then they would pass resolutions and pass them on to the Viceroy, to the Raj, the ruling British in India at that point. Almost none of them were taken very seriously by the British. And so for quite a few years, they would meet on a regular basis and they would discuss these things and pass resolutions of what they thought ought to happen, and then very seldom did anything happen. The biggest problem they had at that point is because they were elite and almost all Hindus. There were only 2 Muslims associated in the first, in the INC, or Indian National Congress. They really were not seen by a large portion of India as representing their interests. They did not have any lower caste people involved. They didn't have any poor folks involved. They didn't have Sikhs. They had only 2 Muslims. And again, there was a large minority population of Muslims in India, obviously. And initially, the INC did not have any ideology. They didn't have any stated mission. They were not seeking anything other than just to talk about these issues and make some recommendations. Over a period of time, however, the frustration level rose when the British government was not listening to any of their suggestions. And so eventually they began to move toward more of a focus on trying to pursue independence. The Quit India movement, as it was called, meaning they wanted the British to quit India or to leave India. And then later on, the Indian Free State Independence movement developed from that. Over a period of time, because of the frustration that they felt, they really developed into sort of two different sections of the Indian National Congress. There were the moderates, the ones who felt like they wanted to continue to work with the British because they valued all of the infrastructure. They valued, all of them were products of English education, British education. So they valued the education, they valued the infrastructure, railways, telegraph, irrigation, bridges, canals, all of that kind of thing, and they did not feel it was in India's best interest to get rid of them. They were the moderates. What they wanted simply was to change the relationships so that particularly, initially, the more Indians had access to the Indian civil service. The Indian civil service, I talked about a little bit before, that was the basic governing body. You know, those were the people who were running the country. And yet it was very, very difficult for anyone who was Indian to get a position in the Indian civil service. Because to do so, you had to take the exam in London and you had to pay your own way. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult for anyone who was not themselves British to understand the test that was taken. And I've seen some of the questions from the Indian Civil Service exam test, and I wouldn't want to take that test. You know, it was pretty horrendous. So even though technically Indians were eligible, they had made it so difficult. The test was never given in India. There was no training in India for civil service, so it was almost entirely British. So this is one of the things that the moderates wanted to open up the opportunities for Indians. They wanted to get more Indians involved in local government, but they were not anxious to try to get rid of the British, at least not initially. But then there developed a more extremist side of the Indian National Congress that advocated agitation at first and then ultimately advocated violence. A couple of other organizations, some of the people got so frustrated with the National Congress that they left and set up other organizations. One was called the Indian National Army. You sort of get the idea there. They were preparing themselves for military action if they felt that was required in order to gain independence. There then, in 1905, and again I mentioned this before, all of this has to overlap, there's too much to do in one talk. In 1905, the Viceroy and Governor General of India, whose name was Lord Curzon comes in and he decides that the Indian national movement was gaining too much momentum. And one of the hotbeds for it was Bengal. They had actually had some minor uprisings in Bengal. And so he decided that he was going to petition the province of Bengal into two halves. One half would be Hindu and the other half would be Muslim, because there was some religious violence occurring. But his primary motivation, we know now from the letters that he wrote and whatnot, was he felt that would be a divide and conquer kind of thing. If we separate these people and have them see us and them within the Indians, then there will be less likelihood of them trying to organize to throw the British out or to create problems. Well, unfortunately for Lord Curzon, everybody, Muslims, Hindus, and everybody else saw that for what it was. They recognized that this was the attempt by the British Raj to suppress any sense of Indian national attitude, and so they were very much in opposition to this. The Muslims and Hindus were together at that point. But unfortunately, there still were a lot of tensions between Muslims and Hindus. The Indian National Congress, and this was a photograph taken at their first meeting in 1885 in Bombay, they had almost no Muslims involved, and those that began to be involved very quickly felt like they were not being represented. And so, a number of years later, in 1906, a new organization was founded called the All India Muslim League. This was a comparable organization to the National Congress, the Indian National Congress, except it was entirely Muslim, whereas the National Congress had become from being mostly Hindu to being entirely Hindu. And so the Muslims felt they needed representation. They created this organization, the All India Muslim League, which later shortened their name to just the Muslim League. they focused from the very start in 1905, they focused on the fact that they felt the Muslim people of India needed their own country, not to advocate for a free India as one, but rather they wanted to have their own nation that was a Muslim nation. In fact, all Muslim, and they talked about, we want a Muslim nation, whereas the Indian National Congress had not talked about having a Hindu nation, they just wanted to have a free nation. The Muslims from the very start said they wanted to have a Muslim nation of their own. And they even had a name for it from very early on. They wanted to call it Pakistan, which means the pure country or the pure state. And so they began to advocate for this in terms of, in their first meeting in 1906 had 3,000 delegates come together. And at that delegation, they were primarily upper-class Muslims as well. But they passed a very clear statement at that point that they wanted to advocate for their own country. This was obviously a real tension, because we need to realize that India had never been one nation. The closest it had ever come to being unified were under the three empires that I talked about before. The Mauryan Empire was the largest, and it was at first Hindu, and then Ashoka, one of the greatest of the emperors of the Mauryan Empire, became Buddhist and advocated Buddhism. Later on, the Guptas were primarily Hindu, and then the Mughals took over later, much later, and they were Muslim leaders. And in every case, there were large sections of the India subcontinent that didn't fall under those empires. So they had never had a sense in which they were one country. So it was not like they were trying to regain something. When the Muslims were saying, we want to have our own nation, it wasn't a violation of, it wasn't like Texas saying they wanted to be their own country, all right? There was no sense of that. They felt the biggest separation was not between people in different regions or castes, but the most important dividing line was between Hindu and Muslim. Fundamentally different, and they felt it wasn't just a religious difference, that it went to the very core of who they were. It was their cultural roots, and so they advocated for a separate nation. As they began to develop that, and again, unlike the Indian National Congress, from the very start, the Muslim League had a very clear sense of where they wanted to go. They had a very clear ideology, and they had very clear objectives. They even knew what they wanted to call their country. And they began to focus by the 1930s, I'm pushing ahead a little bit here, on 4 states in the northwestern part of India that were all predominantly Muslim. And they began to call for that to be created as a separate Muslim country. Well, from this point, stepping back from 1930 a little bit, as they approached the First World War and Britain got involved in the First World War, the reason why the First World War was really a world war, why it was the first time the whole world was at war, is that there were 6 empires on the Eurasian continents. And all of them had territories in other parts of the world. The British Empire, obviously, had Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, India, and when those countries declared war in the First World War, and the way that all happens is astonishing. If you know the history of the beginning of the First World War, I did lectures in the last trip that got into that. When Britain went to war, all of their colonies then were at war, which means India as well. The problem was that Britain was frightened that because of the movement for independence that India would not support the war effort, and that they would they actually would take advantage, as the Irish did in the First World War, to try to take advantage of the preoccupation with the war in order to try to push forward on their independence. But much to Britain's, the Raj's surprise, in World War I, there was an enormous outpouring of support from India for the British cause in the First World War. In fact, India provided 1.3 million soldiers. The various princely regions provided food, a great deal of money. They provided manufacturing of ammunitions. the use of the rail system in India for transportation of goods and soldiers and that sort of thing. And remember, this was a world war. There were battles going on not too far away from India even. So this is something that surprised the British. But despite all of that, the willingness of the Indians to support the war, there still were efforts, particularly in Bengal and Punjab, to promote a regional kind of entity. Now, you had the Muslims and you had the Hindus who were advocating for freedom, the Muslims specifically for their own nation. Well, the Punjab was primarily occupied by Sikhs. I mean, the Sikhs lived that's their center. Some of the Punjab, the Sikhs in the Punjab, began to advocate for their own nation. The Bengal, which was one of the most progressive, one of the most active, they advocated for their own nation. And so Britain, even though India was supporting them, there were areas in India that began during this time to promote independence. But there were a lot of different independence movements that were going on, and very little of it was coordinated. During this period of time, in South Africa, there was a leader of the Indian community in South Africa named Mohandas K. Gandhi. Later on, and actually he was in South Africa, that he was nicknamed the Mahatma. The Mahatma means the Great Spirit, and it was because of his leadership. He had become internationally famous in South Africa because he defended the Indian community of South Africa against the apartheid rule of General Jan Smuts. And they were doing things to the Indians. For instance, the Indians were sharecroppers, what we might know as sharecroppers. They had property that was given to them to raise food on that they then had to pay back, but they were being forced to do things like raise indigo on their property and then forced to sell it at a below market rate, and they were really suffering from that. There were, if they protested, they were arrested. It was a pretty brutal kind of regime against Indians. We think of South Africa being, the apartheid being between whites and blacks, but it was against anyone who was non-white, and the Indians were suffering. Well, Mohandas K. Gandhi had been trained as a British lawyer. He passed the bar exam in Britain. He had, at first when he started trying to be a court attorney, he wasn't very good at it. He was very soft-spoken. He was kind of shy to speak in front of people. This is a man who ended up changing the world to a great extent, and yet at first he wasn't doing well. His family recommended, look, why don't you go down to South Africa and practice being a lawyer for a while? And then you can come back to Britain and have a go of it. Well, he got to South Africa and saw the needs of the people the Indian people in South Africa, was very moved by that, and he became a leader. He developed in South Africa the approach of nonviolent resistance. He advocated not purchasing commercial goods that were not made by Indians. He advocated not paying taxes, not participating in any of the social structures, meaning, don't go to court against anybody using the local courts. In every way possible, simply don't participate in the local government. Well, the economic impact of that, because of not buying the produced products in South Africa, eventually led to the South African government giving him everything he wanted. They released all the Indians that had been imprisoned. They changed the law so that they were not as oppressive to the Indians. He was very successful. Before Gandhi even went back to India, which was not until 1915, he was an internationally known figure for human rights because of the work that he had done in South Africa. And it was in South Africa, as I say, that he got the nickname Mahatma, the Great Spirit. Interestingly, when the war started and he was in South Africa, because he was already an international figure, the British government approached him and said, we need soldiers. Would you help us recruit soldiers? Well, in two previous wars, the Zulu War and the Second War, I'm not even remember the name of it right now, he had agreed to recruit ambulance drivers, non-militant figures. But when they approached him at the start of the First World War and said, can you help us? Will you speak out, be a spokesperson to recruit soldiers? He agreed, and he actually recruited people to fight in the war. He said, I will not participate in any violence. I'm not going to do anything like that. But he produced brochures to recruit people to fight in the war. for many, I mean, until well after his death, there was still a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion about how this fit in with his doctrine of ahimsa. Ahimsa is nonviolence. And he absolutely maintained nonviolence, and yet he was involved in that regard, and so was well known to the British government. Well, in 1915, this is participation of some of the Indian soldiers in the First World War, and they ended up with 60,000 casualties, 60,000 dead, 100,000 wounded. It was a time of great suffering in India by the end of the First World War. And they paid a huge price for their willingness to support the British government during the war. Then in 1915, Gandhi, at the request of some of the people in the Indian National Congress, came back to India and brought with him his ideas about nonviolence and the need to resist oppression in that way. When he first came back, he didn't want to get involved in it. Gandhi initially was not an advocate of trying to drive the British out. He certainly did not go with the extremists who wanted to do anything necessary to get rid of the British. He had been invited by the moderates, and he agreed that yes, the Indians needed more access to civil service jobs and to various other kinds of freedoms, but he did not advocate getting rid of the British because he too valued it. He was a product of the British legal training. Well, eventually, as he lived in India, he began to see the severity of the concerns that they had. And using his international reputation, he eventually convinced the leaders of the Indian National Congress to pursue a program of nonviolent opposition. So they began to protest nonviolently. They began to boycott British goods. Remember, India was providing a lot of the raw materials, cotton and other things, which would be taken to Britain, turned into finished goods, and then brought back to India and resold to the Indians. And he at a huge profit. And India was really suffering because of that. And they were forbidden legally to create industries to compete with Britain. And so there was not a whole lot they could do about that. Well, the boycott of any finished goods from Britain, various protest marches, and something that he had started in India was a program of fasting in protest. Throughout his life, both in South Africa and in India, the Mahatma Gandhi would fast, and his followers would fast. And there were a couple of times he almost died because of the fast. Particularly, this was effective later on during the conflict of the partition of India. But he became known as the unofficial father of the Indian nation. He came back in 1915, and as I mentioned to you, the British had been concerned when the war started that there would be an upheaval, an uprising of the Indians to try to take advantage of the war, as the Irish had done, to try to gain their independence. Well, during that time, the Indians really supported the war effort. And in fact, they supported an act called the Defense of India Act, which gave the British authorities the right to suppress, very, very abruptly suppress, any efforts that seemed to be made in India to try to rebel against the government. They said that anybody who appeared guilty of sedition could be arrested, publications could be suppressed, free speech could be suppressed, people could be held without charges or trial for a period of time. To be honest, it sounds very similar to the kind of rules that were passed, the Patriot Act, after 9/11 in the United States, that the usual civil rights were set aside for the sake of maintaining order. Well, in 1919, that had been just during the war, and the Indians had actually supported that on behalf of the British Raj during the war. In 1919, an organization called the Rowlatt Committee had been assigned to investigate the various kind of minor rebellions and upheavals and things to decide whether that was going to be a continuing problem. Well, they came back with a recommendation that yes, this could be a future problem, and so they recommended extending the Defense of India Act indefinitely. This is, after the war's over, 1919. And so they did. Well, at this point, the Indians were not willing to support that. The idea of being able to suppress freedom of speech, to suppress publications, to arrest people without charges, to hold them indefinitely, to, those kinds of things. And yet the Rowlatt Act in 1919 gave that authority to the British Raj. Well, this really led to a very strong series of demonstrations against the British. In fact, there was a national Hartil, it was called. Hartil was a cessation of work. It was a walkout. Throughout all of India, the Indian workers set aside times they would not go to work. They would not buy British goods. They got much more intensive in terms of their willingness to oppose all of this. It was during this time, immediately following this, that we had the Amritsar massacre that I talked about the other day, where a General Dyer had announced that nobody was allowed to gather. That word didn't get out. The Sikhs were having a festival. 15,000 people gathered. He, in an enclosed courtyard with very few doors leading out of it, and he and his soldiers gathered and began shooting into the unarmed crowd, killed, the projections vary between 379 and 1,499, depending upon whether you ask the British or ask the Indians, and then over 1,100 wounded. It was a horrendous thing. But in Britain, Dyer, this brigadier general, was lauded as a hero by the House of Lords, and they raised money for him, so that when he got back, he was forced out of the army eventually because the House of Commons censured him, but he received a significant pension because of that. And this was the kind of differences that were going on. Gandhi at this time finally convinces the Indian National Congress to aggressively pursue non-participation, this non-violent opposition. He then is elected as the head of the Indian National Congress, and the doctrine of non-cooperation became much more ingrained. So after 1921, Gandhi, as the head of the Indian National Congress, pursued a program, finally, he hadn't at first, but finally a program called Swaraj. Swaraj means self-rule, so that the movement was to become independent. And by the way, these aren't bodies over here. These are people who are outside during the boycotts of work. They would go to their places of work and just sit outside and refuse to do anything. One of the other things that Gandhi did, he was actually sentenced to prison several times in South Africa and in India. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison because of the non-cooperation movements, because he was, he was upsetting the society. He only served 2 years, and he was finally released from that. And he led a number of major efforts. For instance, in 1930, there was the Dandi Salt March. The government of the British Raj had issued a tax on salt. You had to buy the salt from them, and then they were taxing it. Well, salt's naturally occurring. India's got a huge seashore surrounded by salt water. Well, salt is necessary for human life, and so Gandhi and others considered this a violation of basic human rights. They did a 250-mile march to the sea, the Dandi Salt March. When they got to the sea, using shallow pans, they would put salt water in there, let it dry, and when it dried, it left behind salt. And so they were producing their own salt. And this was such a massive movement, the government could not interfere, and so they withdrew the salt tax after that. So he was being very effective in a number of these things. In 1942, he really led the way for what was called the Quit India movement. Part of that was he insisted at that point on wearing homespun, meaning he started, when he was in prison, he started spinning cloth. And after he got out of prison, 4 hours a day, Gandhi would sit and spin cloth. He advocated getting rid of all the technological side of it, not taking advantage of all the technology that had come from outside India, which a lot of people had troubles with because the trains were necessary to move around in India. But he wore homespun. He recommended everyone else wear homespun, and he had a program called Satyagraha, which meant to only use local products, do not attend British schools, do not participate in the British courts, do not take employment from the British, don't pay their taxes, don't accept any honors or titles from them, and this gained widespread support. So by the early 40s, Gandhi was really significantly changing, and all of this had a horrendous economic impact on the British Raj. None of their products were being sold anymore. So this disorder that was being caused by the program of non-participation in anything British unfortunately led to violence. There was one case, the Chowri Chowra incident, where a police station, British police station, was attacked by Hindus and 22 policemen were killed. Well, Gandhi called off the non-cooperation, the non-participation programs because of that. He did not want to cause violence. And so he called for peace. But during this time, the INC, that previously had been the elite of Hindus, began to admit anybody into the Indian National Congress for a token fee, and so they gained mass appeal. All of a sudden they had millions of people who felt they were part of the Indian National Congress under Gandhi's leadership. Again, during this time, starting in the 1920s, there was an emergence of a fairly radical arm, but Gandhi was able to keep them pretty much under control. Many women were involved in this program. Gandhi really advocated for the equality of women, the equality of all caste members. He supported the untouchables as being the lowest of the low caste, and he was very much concerned about equality. And so a lot of women, a lot of low caste people began to get involved, whereas previously they had seen it as an elitist kind of focus. One of the things that Gandhi was very strong on is he wanted to have an independent India, but he wanted that independent India to be one nation with religious pluralism. But in the 1940s, the Muslim League began to advocate even more strongly to have their own nation, and they were very well organized. As a result of that, when finally the British decided to leave India, and they had sent Lord Mountbatten, who was a war hero, part of the royal family, he came to try to set up the terms by which India could be made a dominion, that is, given dominion status underneath within the British Empire, but still self-ruling, as Canada had been in Australia, etc. Well, Mountbatten saw the potential for a horrendous civil war that was brewing. The original plan was that they would establish dominion status by no later than 1948. Well, when he saw the situation and saw, look, as long as Britain is still in charge here, which they were under the Raj, if we stick around and this civil war breaks out, then we're going to be the ones responsible for suppressing it, and we don't have the resources to do that. And so he announced that actually by August of 1947, a year earlier, they would commit themselves to giving Dominion independence to India. Mountbatten and others also saw, because of the fairly militant approach of the Muslims, that the necessity of dividing the country, what's called the partition of India. And so, as they approached that in the mid-40s, there began a movement of Muslims into the predominantly Muslim states and of Hindus into the predominantly Hindu states. These two maps here, this shows you the percentage of Hindus. The vast majority of the body of India was Hindu, but not up here in the Indus River Valley, which is the Punjab, or over here, the Bengal area. This shows the percentage of Muslims, the heavy density here and here. Well, the decision was made by the British that they would accept the Muslim proposal that they create a separate country, that this area, which was already predominantly Muslim, would become, these four states would become a Muslim country, which would be called Pakistan, the Pure Land, which is what they wanted to call it, and also would be joined by this area here in the Bengal state, which was predominantly Muslim. Now, this ended up being West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Later on in 1971, East Pakistan, would declare their independence as the nation of Bangladesh. But at first, it was part of this one united Muslim country. Gandhi opposed the separation, but he was really shouted down by everybody else, the British, by the Muslim League, by many of the Hindu leaders. And by the way, this is Nehru, who became the first prime minister first he was the Secretary General of the Dominion of India and later prime minister. was one of the primary leaders at that time. But a lot of people felt as though Gandhi was too soft-spoken about this, that he was too willing to concede the Muslim and Hindu separation. He didn't like it, but he was willing to accept it rather than have a civil war. Well, because of that, in January 30th of 1948, a radical Hindu nationalist assassinated Gandhi. Gandhi was in an area with his grandnieces. They were outside enjoying the air, and a man walked up to him and shot him 3 times in the chest. This man's name was Naturam Godse. He didn't try to get away. He was arrested. They eventually arrested the people who had been working with him to do this. Godse was executed. He never showed any remorse. He never felt bad about it. Well, after Gandhi was killed, the Prime Minister Nehru said this on the radio. He said, "Friends and comrades, the light has gone out of our lives, and there is darkness everywhere, and I do not quite know what to tell you or how to say it. Our beloved leader, Bapu, as we called him, which meant daddy, father, Bapu, as we called him, the father of the nation, is no more. Perhaps I am wrong to say that. Nevertheless, we will not see him again as we have seen him for these many years. We will not run to him for advice or seek solace from him, and that is a terrible blow, not only for me, but for millions and millions in this country." 2 million people gathered for his funeral. It was a 5-hour procession to his place of burial, and it was drawn on a cart that was pulled by 4 ropes, each of which had 50 supporters. He was one of the most beloved people ever, and yet even the most beloved have someone who wants to do them harm. And so the great loss, Gandhi was never formally named the father of India, but he's informally considered that. His birthday today is a national holiday. It's on the 2nd of October, and it's celebrated as the Gandhi Jayanta. And so they lost Gandhi right at the time of greatest importance as they gained independence. But the independence, because of this division, independence occurred simultaneously with the partition of 2 nations. When the British formally declared that there was a dominion of India and a dominion of Pakistan, there was a migration of 12 million people in both directions. Hindus fearing, who lived in the predominantly Muslim areas that would become Pakistan, feared violence, and they migrated toward the Hindu areas. The Muslims who lived in the Hindu areas migrated into the Muslim areas. It was a massive migration, and nobody was ready for it. Nobody was prepared for that. In addition to the migration, there was horrendous violence. There were cases of where in one state that was predominantly Muslim, like Bengal, the Muslims were massacring Hindus. Well, in the next door state, which predominantly Hindus, hearing of this, massacred Muslims. And this happened everywhere. In fact, when they were in the capital city celebrating the independence of India, Gandhi wasn't there. He was in the areas where violence was occurring, trying to stop it and trying to convince people that this is wrong. This is not consistent with either of your faiths. If you watch the movie Gandhi, there's a scene where he went into a fast, almost died from this fast in order to try to get people to stop, and people were very moved by that. I mean, he was still a beloved character throughout the country, and they, at one point in the movie, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's representative of what the attitude that he had. There's a point where a Hindu who has committed violence comes up to Gandhi as he's fasting and near death and says, "Bapu, stop this, eat something, we need you." And he said, "Well, for me to do that, I need for you to do something. I need for you to find a Muslim child who has lost their parents in the violence, adopt that child." And the guy says, certainly I will do that. And Gandhi said, "But more, you have to raise that child as a Muslim." So his attitude of trying to have this pluralistic society, he advocated all the way up to his death. But the partition not only had 12 million people moving, there were 2 million people killed by the religious violence that occurred there. And again, everybody says, well, religion causes all the wars in the world. No, this was really a political conflict. It just so happens, as it did in Northern Ireland, that the political divisions had been drawn along religious lines. And that gives a very convenient excuse. So 2 million people died. Another 2.3 million people were lost. You know, we don't know what happened to them, but they were lost along the way. They were missing. And so eventually, they did create the two nations. They still continue to have migrations, Hindus from the Muslim areas into the main body of India, and Muslims from India into Pakistan for many, many years. In fact, we have records of those migrations still occurring as late as 2014. So there has always been some sense of violence. Pakistan and India do not get along. I think I mentioned in one of the talks that one of our guides, when we were in India, she was talking about cricket, and she's a huge cricket fan, and she said, you know, we don't mind if our Indian national cricket team loses to anybody else, Canada, Kenya, she mentioned, but they cannot lose to Pakistan. Now that was a lighthearted comment, but it reflects a pretty deep-seated feeling, and the difficult part for the rest of the world is and these countries is both Pakistan and India are nuclear powers. They both have nuclear weapons, and that's why there's always that tension between Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India. And again, in 1971, this area here became the Islamic Republic of Bangladesh. And so now we have three countries that came out of that. This is a little note that Gandhi scribbled at one point in 1927. He wrote, "God is truth. The way to truth lies through ahimsa," which means nonviolence. And yet he died at the hand of a violent Hindu nationalist and never had the opportunity to see the settling down into India, the nation of India, and the nation of Pakistan. Questions about any of that?
Yes. Why they Hindu they kill Gandhi? Why the reason?
They thought that the man who killed him was a militant Hindu nationalist, and they thought that Gandhi should have had the power to force a Hindu nation. And he didn't. He was too soft-spoken. And so they assassinated him for it. Now, again, we would think in terms of, okay, everybody get together, and then you have elections, and you have a percentage of Muslims and a percentage of Hindus in the parliament, etc. But their feeling was, the Muslims especially felt as though we will be overwhelmed. The population was predominantly Hindu, and so if we are one nation, the Hindus will have more political power. Again, this is the same issue having to do with Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. It wasn't that they didn't like the way somebody else worshipped, it's that they thought they're a majority and they will have political control over us. And the line just happened to be drawn because of previous generations and years of conflict between Catholics and Protestants in the southern part of Ireland. Same thing here. The Muslims felt like if we're one nation, we're outnumbered, and they will tell us what to do, and eventually we'll maybe try to suppress our culture, our religion. The Hindus felt we're the majority, why do we have to make concessions? And because they were dividing up resources. Pakistan got the Indus River Valley, and there's some very fertile areas in there, very historic in terms of the history of the Indian subcontinent, etc. And so there had to be a dividing up of resources, a dividing up of the national treasury, and various other kinds of things. And so many of the Hindus felt like, why are we having to do this? We're the majority. Why do we have to make such concessions to creation of the Muslim state? And that's why a radical Hindu nationalist killed Gandhi.
Stupid.
Yes, Arsha.
In a wonderful book that I read on this subject, Freedom at Midnight, the authors who did a great deal of research indicate that Jinnah, who was the strong voice for partition, was very sick with tuberculosis during this entire time. He actually died within a year of partition.
Right.
And they make the suggestion that had Jinnah died of tuberculosis prior, with Gandhiji's strong influence for United India, the violence was happening anyway, but they make the case that partition might never have happened. I just wondered what your thoughts on that from all you've read.
Yeah, the leader of the Muslim League and the predominant advocate for the creation of a Muslim state was Muhammad Jinnah. And Gandhi maintained good relationships with him because, again, Gandhi wanted, you call him Gandhiji, which is the formal expression. And Gandhi maintained good relations both with Nehru, who became the leader of the Dominion of India, and also with Jinnah. Jinnah was sick with tuberculosis. He stepped down after less than a year as prime minister and did die of tuberculosis. The question was asked, if he had died earlier or had not been in that position, would this have happened? Well, he was the primary voice and the primary leader of the Muslim League and of the partition into two nations. But there were a lot of others as well. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't say, oh, if he hadn't been there, what would have happened? My guess is that it might not have happened as quickly, but eventually I think the partition would have taken place. Obviously, people felt so strongly about it, strong enough to assassinate Gandhiji, then I think eventually it would have gotten there. But Jinnah was definitely the strongest voice in advocating a Muslim partition. Other questions? Yes?
Just one. I don't know if you know this, but do you have any idea how those two countries came to their nuclear power? Who gave it to them, or where did they get the resources?
So how did they get their nuclear power? I don't know that story.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know.
Good question.
Yeah. It's probably the United States had nuclear weapons, and of course, because of espionage, the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons not long after that. Because there was always this brinksmanship, this idea of you either get support from the West or you get support from the East, the Soviet Union, and which one's going to give us more stuff? And that more stuff was food, it was aid of all kinds, but it also included military support. And so I don't know the story, but my guess is that there was a negotiation somewhere, and the Soviet Union provided them the technology so that they would, so that they maintain that leak. This is one of the reasons we talked about why the U.S. and India have had sometimes a rocky relationship. They are an ally. We actually are allies with Pakistan too, although very, it's a very rocky, even more rocky relationship. And some of that is because some of these countries have at various times in their history looked to the Soviet Union or to Russia for support. Well, everybody did that. In fact, for India, the presence of the British in India, I think I mentioned this the other day, the only thing separating them from what was the Soviet Union was Afghanistan. And the British and the Russians were engaged in what they called, for many years, the Great Game. It was sort of their version, British and Russian version of the Cold War. And it was the matter of trying to gain control or influence within this part of Central Asia. Well, because Britain was in India, that's one of the major reasons why the Russians invaded Afghanistan. Because Afghanistan was a border state, and the Russians felt like if we don't take control of Afghanistan, then the British may move north and take control of it. Then we have no buffer between us. And at one point, Britain and Russia, the US was into it by then, before obviously they came into Afghanistan. The Russians came into Afghanistan, but for many, many years, Britain and Russia were the two world powers, and so the US really didn't get up to that level until after the First World War. So there had always been this competition, and much to their misfortune, the Russians decided to invade Afghanistan to try to take over that border area between them and British India, and we all know how that worked out for the Russians. Any other questions? Yes?
Regarding the origin of nuclear technology, etc.
Right?
It is also possible that the science and technology of Pakistan may have been as advanced as it is in Princeton. It doesn't have to be transfer of technology and brain power from the US and Russia to the third world. Because there are many Nobel Prizes in physics and astronomy. The reason that Pakistan is out front is because of the links with Al-Qaeda and violence and so on.
Right.
But their science was as good, if not better, than that in the West. So it's possible that they may have independently used the physics and science of the day to develop their nuclear weapons.
Right, so his comment was that because there has been a lot of scientific capability in Pakistan and in India as well. I mean, they're considered industrialized nations, you know, and very advanced in some technologies, that they may have developed that technology themselves. My comment, in most cases, it's because one side or the other had given it to them, had given them the technology. So I'm making an assumption there that may not be accurate. They may have developed it on their own. But they have it now, and that's the difficult part. Yes, Roger?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, because the indication of the Russian involvement or assistance reflect in the first aircraft carrier was a carrier from Russia. It's a Russian aircraft carrier. At that time, they are really sided with the Soviet Union. Okay, so I agree with you. I think they probably get some kind of assistance
Yeah,
too from the Soviet.
right.
I do have one comment here. One of my heroes, Albert Einstein, he said after Gandhi's death, he said, among all the souls that ever walked on the surface of the earth, none is greater than Gandhi.
Okay. So the quote is that Einstein said after Gandhi's death that of all the souls that have ever walked on the earth, none was greater than Gandhi. And the suggestion that the first aircraft carrier that India had came from the Soviet Union.
Yep.
So there was a transfer of military technology there. So, but I don't actually know how they came to that. Thank you all very much. Tomorrow we'll talk about tea and cricket, a little bit lighter topic.